I was 22 when I first visited my dad's friend's cabin. His name was Robert, but everyone called him Rob. He was a big guy, maybe in his late 40s, with rough hands from years of working in construction. He had a thick beard that was turning gray and always smelled like sawdust and coffee. My dad and Rob had been friends since they were kids, and growing up, I heard plenty of stories about their hunting trips and late-night card games out in the woods. Rob owned a cabin deep in the forest, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. It wasn't one of those fancy, modern cabins you'd see in a vacation ad. It was old, built from thick logs, with a metal roof that made a racket when it rained. There was no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was the kind of place that felt cut off from the rest of the world. The trip came about when my dad called me up one day and said Rob needed help fixing up the place. The winter storms had knocked down a few trees, and the roof needed patching up. I had nothing better to do, so I agreed. We packed up tools, supplies, and enough food to last a week, then drove out in my dad's old truck. The road to the cabin was rough, just a dirt trail winding through thick trees. By the time we arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the woods. The place looked exactly like I expected, solid, worn down, but still standing strong. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees. A river ran about a mile away, and there was a shed behind the cabin full of old tools and hunting gear. As soon as we got out of the truck, I noticed how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that made you feel like something was watching you.
No birds.
No wind rustling through the trees, just silence. My dad didn't seem to notice, though. He and Rob started unloading the truck while I walked around, getting a feel for the place. The first night was uneventful. We sat by the fire outside, drinking beers and listening to my dad and Rob tell old stories. The air was crisp, the stars were bright, and for a while I actually enjoyed being out there. Eventually, we turned in for the night. The cabin had 2 rooms, one with a big bunk bed and another smaller room where Rob slept. I took the top bunk and my dad took the bottom. I fell asleep fast but woke up sometime in the night. The room was pitch black, and the only sound was my dad's slow, steady breathing. Then I heard it, something moving outside. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I lay completely still, listening. The steps were heavy, crunching through the leaves and twigs. They stopped right outside the window next to my bunk. I held my breath, waiting. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. The next morning, I mentioned it to my dad and Rob. Rob just shrugged. "Could have been a deer," he said. My dad agreed, but something about the way they looked at each other made me think they weren't so sure. We spent the day working on the cabin. I climbed up on the roof to patch the holes while my dad and Rob cut up some fallen trees. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every now and then, I'd stop and look around, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, but there was nothing. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise made me jump. The wind picked up, making the trees groan. The old wooden walls creaked as the cabin settled. Around midnight, I heard something again, this time from inside the cabin, a soft scraping sound. It came from the main room, just outside our door. I lay there, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then something knocked against the table, a quiet thump, like someone had bumped into it. I felt my dad shift in the bunk below me. He must have heard it too. Neither of us moved. The sound stopped. Then the cabin was silent again. The next morning, Rob was already outside when we got up. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much. My dad asked if he had heard anything, and he just nodded. "Yeah," he said, "but I didn't see anything." We finished the roof that afternoon. Rob suggested we take a break and do some fishing at the river. I was happy to get away from the cabin for a while, so we packed up some gear and headed out. The river was calm and the fishing was good. For the first time since we arrived, I felt relaxed. We caught a few fish, talked about old times, and for a little while, I almost forgot about the footsteps and the noises in the night. Then, as we were heading back, I noticed something. Along the riverbank, about 20 feet from where we had been sitting, were fresh footprints. Barefoot, large, and deep, like whoever made them was heavy. I pointed them out to my dad and Rob. Rob just stared at them for a long time before finally saying, "We should head back." That night, none of us slept well. Every little noise set me on edge. The wind picked up again, rattling the old windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside, the same slow footsteps as before, but this time they didn't stop. They moved around the cabin, past the shed, through the trees. Then, after a while, they faded into the distance. The next morning, Rob made a decision. "We're leaving," he said. We packed up fast. Rob didn't explain, and we didn't ask. As we loaded up the truck, I took one last look at the cabin. Something about it felt different now. As we drove away, I asked my dad if he had any idea what was out there. He just shook his head. "Rob's been coming out here for years," he said. "If he says it's time to go, it's time to go." We never talked about it again. Rob never invited us back, and I never asked. A few years later, I heard he sold the cabin. He never said why, and I never wanted to know. It was the summer of 1998 when I found myself spending a few weeks at my uncle's old farm cabin. The property sat deep in the countryside, a good 20 miles from the nearest town. It wasn't a place I had ever thought much about until that year. My uncle, a man who had always kept to himself, had passed away unexpectedly, and since I was between jobs at the time, my father asked me to head out there and look after the place until we figured out what to do with it. The idea of being alone on that isolated farm didn't sit well with me, but I had no excuse to turn it down. The drive out there was uneventful, just endless fields, stretches of dirt roads, and occasional signs pointing to farms I had never heard of. My uncle's land was big, too big if you asked me. He owned the cabin, a barn, and an old shed that sat a little too far from the main buildings. The woods surrounded the property on 3 sides, thick and dark, even in the daytime. From what I remembered, my uncle had never really done much with the land beyond growing enough crops to get by. He never had any livestock and rarely had visitors. He was the kind of man who seemed to be perfectly fine being alone. The cabin itself was in decent shape, just old. It was a single-story wooden structure, the kind you see in old pictures, with a slanted roof and a front porch that creaked when you stepped on it. Inside, it smelled of dust and wood, the air thick with the scent of a place that hadn't been lived in for a while. There was no TV, just a few old radios that barely worked, and the electricity came from a generator out back. It wasn't much, but it would do for a few weeks. The first few days were quiet. I spent most of my time fixing up the place, clearing out junk my uncle had hoarded over the years. I checked the barn, which was mostly empty except for some rusted tools and old wooden crates stacked against the walls. The shed, though, was locked and I didn't have the key. My uncle had always been secretive, and part of me figured he just kept useless junk in there, but another part of me felt uneasy about it. At night, the quiet was the worst part. In the city, there was always noise, cars, voices, something. But out there, it was just the wind and the occasional sound of an animal moving through the grass. I never really got used to it. The nights stretched on, and I found myself lying awake more often than not, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the sun to rise. It was on the 6th night that I first heard it. A sound, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere outside. It was a rustling noise, like someone moving through the tall grass near the barn. I sat up, listening, my body tense. The wind was blowing, but this was different. Slow, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and made my way to the front porch, the boards creaking beneath my feet. The light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the open field and toward the barn. Nothing, just the wind bending the grass. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the door when I went back inside, something I hadn't thought to do before. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the property, looking for signs of anything unusual. I found nothing, but that feeling of unease stayed with me. That night, the noise came again. Only this time, it was closer. The same rustling, but now it was near the porch. I stayed in bed, gripping the flashlight, listening. Then, just as I thought I was imagining it, I heard something tap against the window. Not loud, just a single, deliberate tap. I turned the flashlight on and aimed it at the window, but by the time I looked, there was nothing there. My chest was tight as I got up and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the glass. The yard was empty. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked outside again. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But as I walked past the barn, something caught my eye. The lock on the shed. It was old and rusted, but something about it seemed off. It looked like it had been tampered with. I tried shaking it, but it held firm. I thought about forcing it open, but part of me didn't want to know what was inside. I told myself I was overthinking things, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair. I kept the flashlight close, my ears tuned to every sound. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin feel even smaller. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The rustling, closer this time. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the grass, coming from the direction of the shed. I gripped the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder until it was just outside the cabin. Then silence. I held my breath. Seconds passed. Then the doorknob rattled. It wasn't the wind. Something was trying to get in. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The rattling stopped, and then came a sound that sent ice through my veins. The creaking of the porch boards. It was on the porch. I aimed the flashlight toward the door, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. I just sat there, gripping it, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the sound of footsteps faded, moving away. I didn't sleep. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I needed to get inside that shed. I grabbed a crowbar from the barn and forced the lock open. The door groaned as I pushed it aside, and the smell that hit me was overwhelming. Stale, damp, and something else. Something metallic. Inside, the shed was small and cluttered, but one thing stood out immediately. A trapdoor in the floor. A thick, heavy padlock held it shut, but this one was newer, sturdy. Someone had put it there recently. I hesitated, my hands sweating. Then, gripping the crowbar, I wedged it beneath the lock and pried it loose. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a set of wooden steps leading down into darkness. A cold wave of air rushed up from below, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach turn. I pointed the flashlight down, the beam cutting through the shadows. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a room, a small concrete space with chains bolted to the walls. And in the far corner, a pile of old clothes and bones. Human bones. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. My uncle had never been a friendly man, but this was something else. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I grabbed my bag from the cabin, jumped into my truck, and drove. I never looked back. I told the police everything, and a week later, they confirmed what I already knew. My uncle had been keeping something or someone down there. They never found out who the bones belonged to. I didn't want to know. I never went back to that farm. I never liked driving alone at night, but I had no choice that evening. I had just finished some work in a small town outside of Manchester and had a long drive back home to a quiet village near the Scottish border. The rain had been relentless all day, and by the time I started my journey, the roads were slick, the sky pitch black. My headlights barely cut through the thick sheets of water pounding against the windshield. I took a back road to save time, a narrow, winding path through the countryside, flanked by dense trees. It was one of those roads where you rarely saw another car, especially at night. The trees loomed overhead, forming a tunnel of darkness, the only sounds being the rhythmic beat of the rain and the hum of my tires over wet asphalt. I had been driving for nearly an hour when I saw a light in the distance. It was off the side of the road, barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it was just another farmhouse, but as I got closer, I realized it was a small wooden cabin, its windows glowing faintly. It looked old, abandoned even, the kind of place that had been there for decades, forgotten by most. The sight of it made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around it, or the fact that there were no visible signs of life. No car, no movement inside, just that dim, flickering light. As I passed by, something caught my eye. A woman was standing in the window, staring out into the night. I nearly slammed on the brakes. She was barely illuminated by the weak glow from within, but I could make out her features. Pale skin, dark hair hanging over her shoulders, her face completely expressionless. She wasn't looking at me, not exactly. She was staring past me, as if watching something further down the road. I tried to shake it off. People lived in isolated places all the time. Maybe she was just some farmer's wife, watching the rain, waiting for someone to return home. But something about her unsettled me. I kept driving, telling myself it was nothing. But then, a few miles down the road, I saw her again, standing by the edge of the forest, barely visible in the darkness. I know how that sounds. It wasn't possible. I had just seen her in that cabin. There was no way she could have reached this spot so quickly. And yet, there she was. The same pale face, the same long, dark hair. This time, she was facing me directly, her eyes locked onto mine as I sped past. A chill ran through me. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. I didn't slow down. The rain only got worse as I drove. The road twisted through the countryside, the trees pressing in from both sides. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road behind me. But there was nothing, just darkness. I kept telling myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had seen a different woman, a trick of the light, a weird shadow cast by the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then, up ahead, my headlights illuminated something in the road. A figure. I barely had time to react. I swerved sharply, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. My car slid sideways before coming to a stop just inches from the ditch. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked up. She was standing right in front of my car, close enough now that I could see the details of her face. She was older than I had first thought, her skin unnaturally pale, almost gray. Her lips were thin, pressed together in a tight, unreadable expression. But it was her eyes that sent fear through me. Dark, sunken, void of any emotion. She didn't move, didn't react, just stood there staring. I fumbled to put the car into reverse, my hands shaking. As soon as I looked down, just for a split second, she disappeared. I didn't waste time. I floored it. The road ahead was a blur, my wipers barely keeping up with the rain. I didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. I just kept going, pushing the speed limit, desperate to put as much distance between me and that woman as possible. I don't know how long I drove like that, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, but eventually, the road straightened out, the rain eased up, and I saw the faint glow of a village in the distance. Relief washed over me. I wasn't sure what I had seen, what I had experienced, but I knew one thing for certain. I was never taking that road again. When I finally made it home, I locked my doors, shut my curtains, and sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes before finally working up the courage to step inside. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That I saw the same woman in 3 different places, miles apart, on a road where no one should have been walking. That she disappeared the second I looked away? No one would believe me. For a long time, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. A mix of exhaustion, the rain, the eerie isolation of the road. But a week later, I made the mistake of looking up the area online. There was only one mention of the cabin. An old post in a forgotten forum. Someone else had seen her too. A traveler passing through, just like me. He described the same thing. An old wooden cabin, a woman standing in the window, then appearing further down the road. He had tried to stop, tried to talk to her. And then he was never seen again. I shut my laptop and never looked up that road again. Some places are best left alone. Some things aren't meant to be understood. And I never, ever take the back roads anymore. I never should have taken that job. It was meant to be temporary, just a way to make some money before I figured out what I really wanted to do. I had just turned 30, and I was stuck in a rut, working random jobs with no real plan for the future. When I saw the ad looking for a caretaker for an old graveyard, I figured it would be easy. The pay was better than what I was making at the time, and it came with a place to stay, a small cabin on the property. The graveyard was a few miles outside of a small town in northern Pennsylvania, surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't one of those perfectly maintained cemeteries with trimmed grass and polished headstones. This one was old, the kind of place where time had worn everything down. The headstones were cracked, some leaning at odd angles, and there were patches of high grass and weeds everywhere. A rusted iron fence ran around the property, with a gate that barely stayed on its hinges. The man who hired me was an older guy named Bill. He was in his 60s, short, with a round stomach and rough hands. He had been the caretaker for years, but was retiring and moving down south. I met him at the graveyard one afternoon, and he gave me a quick tour. "The cabin's nothing fancy," he said as we walked toward it. "No plumbing, but there's a well out back. Got a generator for power. Should be enough for what you need." The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, made of old wood that had turned gray over time. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. It had a single door, a tiny front porch, and 2 windows, one on each side. Inside, there was a cot, a wood stove, a small table, and a few shelves. It smelled like dust and damp wood. I was already second-guessing my decision, but Bill handed me the keys and left. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the loose boards on the cabin. The graveyard was right outside my window, the headstones barely visible in the dark. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but I told myself it was just the wind. My job was simple: keep the place from getting overgrown, clear out any trash, and make sure no one was trespassing. I spent most of my days trimming weeds, cutting back bushes, and trying to fix up the fence. It was tiring work, but it kept my mind occupied. At night, though, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The first thing was the footprints. One morning, I found a set of muddy footprints leading from the woods to one of the graves near the edge of the cemetery. They were fresh, not even disturbed by the wind. They led right up to the headstone and stopped. There were no prints leading away. I looked around, expecting to see someone hiding nearby, but the woods were empty. That same night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the wind this time. It was steady, deliberate. Footsteps. I lay still, listening. The steps moved across the graveyard, crunching against the dirt and dried leaves. Then they stopped right outside my cabin. I held my breath, waiting. A long silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away, back toward the graves. I didn't sleep after that. A few days later, I found something else. One of the graves had been disturbed. The dirt looked freshly dug up, like someone had been trying to get to the coffin. But there was no shovel, no tools, nothing nearby that could explain it. I started keeping my rifle next to my bed after that. More nights passed, and the noises continued. Sometimes it was footsteps. Other times, I'd hear something scraping against the cabin walls. Once, I thought I heard breathing just outside my window. I tried to tell myself it was animals, maybe deer or coyotes, but deep down I knew better. Then one night I saw him. It was past midnight and I had given up on sleeping. I sat at the small table, staring at the lamp's dim glow, when I caught movement outside my window. A figure stood between the graves, tall, thin, just standing there motionless. I grabbed my rifle and moved slowly toward the door. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had to do something. I stepped out onto the porch, aiming the rifle into the dark. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward. My boots crunched against the dirt. The figure twitched, just slightly, then turned and walked toward the woods. I should have let him go. I should have locked myself inside the cabin and waited for morning. But I didn't. I followed him. The night was cold, and my breath came out in quick, shaky clouds. The figure moved slowly, almost lazily, weaving between the graves. I kept my distance, my finger resting on the trigger. Then he stopped, right at the disturbed grave. He stood there for a long moment. Then, without warning, he dropped to his knees and started digging. Not with a shovel, with his hands. I took a step back, and a twig snapped under my boot. The figure froze. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward me. That was the first time I saw his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes were sunken, dark hollows in his face. His mouth hung open, lips cracked and dry. His hands, covered in dirt, twitched slightly as he stared at me. I raised the rifle. "Get away from there," I said, my voice unsteady. He didn't move. I backed away slowly, never lowering the gun. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the job, about the money, I just wanted out. I drove into town and found Bill's number in an old phone book. When I called, he didn't sound surprised. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "Figured you'd leave sooner or later." I asked him who the man in the graveyard was.
"Bill side."
"Ain't my place to say," he muttered. "But you did the right thing leaving." That was the last time I spoke to him. I never went back. I don't know what that man was doing, why he was digging, why he was there at all. Maybe I don't want to know. All I know is that I never should have taken that job. I was working a late shift again, something I had gotten used to over the years. Being a furniture mechanic meant long hours, but the pay was decent, and I didn't mind being alone with my tools. It was peaceful in a way. The rhythmic hum of my sander, the sharp clink of a hammer meeting a nail, it all had a strange sort of music to it. This particular job was in a remote cabin, deep in the woods of Oregon. A customer had bought an old place, planning to fix it up into a weekend retreat. Most of the structure was in decent condition, but the furniture inside had suffered years of neglect. That's where I came in. My task was to repair, restore, or replace every wooden fixture inside. Tables, chairs, cabinets, doors, everything. I'd already been working there for a few days, and with the deadline coming up, I had agreed to pull a late shift to get it all done. The cabin sat in the middle of nowhere, an hour's drive from the nearest town. No streetlights, no cell service, no neighbors, just miles of dark, dense forest. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but there was something unsettling about the silence of that place. The trees outside barely moved, even when the wind picked up, and at night, the only sound was the rain hammering against the roof. By the time I finished my dinner, a cold sandwich I had brought with me, it was already past 9 p.m. The rain had started to pick up, heavier than before, drumming against the windows and roof like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping all at once. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine and got back to work. The main task for the night was an old wooden cabinet in the kitchen. The hinges were rusted, the doors wouldn't close properly, and the back panel was so warped it was barely hanging on. I figured I'd replace the hinges first, then work my way down. I had my toolbox open, a lantern set up for extra light, and the radio playing some low, static-filled station just to break the silence. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The wind outside had picked up, and with it came the occasional creak from the old wooden walls. Normal, I told myself, just the house settling. Then I heard something else. A sound from outside, something distinct from the rain or wind, a crunching noise, like footsteps on wet leaves. I paused, holding my breath, listened. Nothing, just the rain. I shook my head and went back to work. I was in the middle of replacing a hinge when I heard it again. Closer this time. Not just a crunch, but a deliberate, measured step. The kind that didn't belong to a deer or some small animal. I set my tools down quietly and walked to the window. The glass was fogged up from the humidity inside, but I could make out the dark outline of the trees. Rain blurred the view, but there was nothing obvious. Just darkness and the steady downpour. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I went back to work, my hands moving faster now. The sooner I finished, the sooner I could leave. Minutes passed. Then another noise, this one from inside the house. A floorboard creaked in the next room. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The house had been empty when I arrived, and I had locked the door behind me. I was sure of it. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight. I stepped out of the kitchen, scanning the living room. The lantern cast long shadows, flickering as the wind rattled the windows. Nothing looked out of place, but something didn't feel right. I stepped toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The floor creaked beneath my boots, but I could hear another creak, softer, delayed, like an echo, like someone was stepping when I stepped. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to move forward. My flashlight beam swept across the hallway, door slightly ajar, an old wooden dresser against the wall, peeling wallpaper. Nothing unusual, but the air felt different, heavier. I stepped into the first bedroom. Empty. Second bedroom. Also empty. Then I heard a sound from the kitchen, the sound of my toolbox being moved. I spun around fast, heart pounding. When I got back to the kitchen, the toolbox was exactly where I had left it. But one of the drawers was slightly open. I hadn't left it like that. My hands were sweating. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. Someone had been inside. I needed to leave. I grabbed my car keys from the counter and took a step toward the door. Then I stopped. The door was unlocked. I knew, without a doubt, that I had locked it when I arrived. Someone had been inside. Maybe still was. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. If I ran to my truck, I'd have to go through the dark, open yard, completely exposed. If someone was out there, they'd see me, they'd hear me. I turned off the flashlight, letting the darkness swallow the room. If someone was inside, I didn't want to give away my position. For a full minute, I just stood there, listening. Nothing. Then another noise, faint, slow creak, from inside the cabin. Not from the floor this time, but from above. The attic. I had never checked the attic. I hadn't needed to. It wasn't part of the job. But someone had been up there, and I wasn't alone. I felt trapped. If I ran for the door, whoever was in the attic might hear me. If I stayed, I was just waiting for them to make the next move. A single, slow breath left my lungs. I made my decision. I bolted for the door, yanking it open. The storm hit me like a wall. Cold, wet, deafening. I sprinted across the yard, my boots sinking into the mud. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with rain. My truck was just ahead, but I could feel something behind me, watching, waiting. I wrenched the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. My breath was ragged, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't look back at the cabin. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the rain. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I caught one last glimpse in the mirror, a figure, standing in the attic window, watching me leave. I didn't go back the next day. I called the owner, told him I wouldn't be finishing the job. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. I don't know who was in that cabin, how they got in, or what they wanted. All I knew was that I had locked the door, and someone had still been inside. I had been driving for hours. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world outside my truck had turned into an endless stretch of black. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding road that snaked through the dense forest. The rain had started about an hour ago, first as a drizzle, then as a steady downpour. Now it was hammering against my windshield, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I had planned this trip for weeks. A weekend alone in a rented cabin deep in the woods, away from work, away from people. I needed the silence. The exhaustion of daily life had been wearing me down, and I figured a couple of nights in solitude would help clear my head. I had found the cabin through an old online listing. The pictures showed a sturdy wooden structure with a wide porch, a stone fireplace, and a small dock extending over a lake. It looked perfect. No neighbors, no traffic, just trees, water, and quiet. The owner had given me instructions to find it since GPS wouldn't work this far into the wilderness. I checked the directions again. Turn right at the unmarked dirt road after the mile marker. I slowed the truck and spotted a narrow path veering off the main road. It was barely visible through the rain, just a break in the trees leading into pure darkness. My headlights revealed deep tire tracks in the mud, so I knew this was the way. I turned onto the path, the wet gravel crunching under my tires. The road was rough. Potholes and rocks made the truck lurch and rattle. Tree branches reached in from both sides, scraping against the metal. I kept going, my hands gripping the wheel tighter. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the thought of getting stuck out here made me uneasy. After what felt like forever, I saw it, the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. Just a single-story structure with a pitched roof and a covered porch. The wood was weathered, darkened by years of rain and neglect. There were no lights on. I parked in the small clearing beside it and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate. The rain drummed against the roof, but beyond that, nothing. No birds, no wind, just emptiness. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and hurried to the porch. The front door was locked, but the owner had left the key under a loose board, just like they said. I found it, slid it into the lock, and pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and dust. The air was heavy, stale. A single lantern sat on the wooden table in the center of the room, next to a stack of firewood. The place was basic, just one large room with a bed, a small kitchenette, and a fireplace. A narrow door led to what I assumed was the bathroom. I set my bag down and lit the lantern. The glow flickered across the walls, casting long shadows. I checked my phone. No service. I expected that. I locked the front door, bolted it, then went to the window. The rain blurred the glass, but I could still make out the dark tree line in the distance. There was no movement, no sign of anyone else, just the forest. I exhaled and tried to shake off the unease. I was just tired. The drive, the rain, the isolation, it was getting to me. I unpacked my things, lit a fire in the hearth, and sat down in the old wooden chair beside it. The warmth helped. The flames crackled, filling the cabin with a soft glow. I let myself relax, listening to the rain, letting the fatigue settle over me. Then I heard something outside, faint crunch. My body tensed. Could have been an animal. A deer, maybe. The forest was full of them. But it didn't sound like hooves. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I stood up and moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. The rain was heavy, making it hard to see anything. I pressed my face to the glass, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I waited. Seconds passed. A full minute. Then another sound. Closer. My breath hitched. It wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing. Slow, deep breaths, just outside the cabin. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering. Someone was out there, standing in the rain, watching. I reached for my bag, fumbling for the hunting knife I always carried on trips like this. My fingers wrapped around the handle, my knuckles white. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to listen. Then the doorknob rattled. A sharp jolt of terror shot through me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was trying to get in. I gripped the knife tighter, my body rigid. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then slow, dragging footsteps moved around the cabin. Whoever it was, they were circling me. I moved to the fireplace, grabbed the heaviest log I could find. If they broke in, I wasn't going down without a fight. The footsteps stopped near the back of the cabin. Then the scratching started. Long, deliberate scrapes against the wood. Nails, maybe, or a knife, slowly dragging along the walls, making a sickening sound that sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. The scratching stopped. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Then dawn. The first hints of light crept through the rain. I forced myself to move, to inch toward the window. The forest was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Just wet earth and falling rain. But I knew what I heard. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything inside, and bolted for the truck. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I turned onto the main road, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent, dark, but just for a second, so brief I almost thought I imagined it. I saw movement in the trees, someone standing there, watching me leave. I never went back. I was never one to believe in stories. My dad used to tell me about things that roamed the woods at night, creatures that weren't quite animals but weren't people either. I always thought he was just trying to scare me, to keep me from wandering too far when we went camping or hiking. But I wasn't a kid anymore, and I had been in the wilderness more times than I could count. I had hunted, fished, and camped alone for years without anything happening. That changed one winter when I took a solo trip to a remote hunting cabin in northern Montana. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my father's, a man named Bill. He was one of those off-the-grid types, the kind of guy who only came into town once every few months for supplies. He built the place himself decades ago, deep in the woods, far from any paved roads. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table. No electricity, no running water, just 4 walls and a roof. I needed the time away. Life had been weighing me down lately, and I figured a week in the wilderness would clear my head. I loaded up my truck with enough food, water, and firewood to last me at least a week. I also brought my rifle just in case I decided to do some hunting. I was looking forward to the solitude, to the quiet. The drive to the cabin took nearly 4 hours, most of it on dirt roads covered in a thin layer of snow. It had been an unusually cold winter, and more snow was expected later in the week. I didn't mind. I had enough supplies to last, and I knew how to handle myself in the cold. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to set. I parked my truck a short distance away and hiked in with my gear. The place was just as I remembered, small, sturdy, and surrounded by dense pine trees. The nearest town was over 30 miles away, and as the last light faded, the silence of the wilderness settled in. That first night was peaceful. I got a fire going in the stove, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the small window, looking out into the dark woods. The cold made everything still, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. I slept well that night. The next morning, I decided to go out and check for any fresh tracks. I wasn't expecting much, but I figured I'd see if there was any game nearby. The snow made it easy to spot movement, and after about an hour of walking, I found some tracks. They were large, too big to be a coyote, but not quite the right shape for a wolf. The strangest thing was that they didn't seem to have a clear direction. The prints circled back on themselves, doubling over in a way that didn't make sense. I had spent enough time in the woods to know how animals moved, and this wasn't normal. I followed them for a while, but they eventually led me back toward my own cabin. That unsettled me. I had left before sunrise, and the tracks hadn't been there the night before. Whatever had made them had been near my cabin sometime during the night. I told myself it was probably just a lost animal, maybe a mountain lion acting strange. I didn't let it bother me too much. I spent the rest of the day gathering wood, checking my supplies, and making sure everything was set for the next few days. That night, I stayed up later than usual, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind had picked up, and every so often, I thought I heard something moving outside. Not footsteps exactly, more like the crunching of snow, slow and deliberate. I stepped outside with my rifle, scanning the trees with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the heavy snowfall. The moment I stepped off the porch, the sound stopped. The silence was thick, pressing against me. I told myself it was just the wind. But when I turned back toward the cabin, I saw them. More tracks in the snow. They hadn't been there before, and they were fresh. This time, they led straight to my cabin door. A deep unease settled over me. Someone or something had been outside while I was inside, standing just a few feet from where I slept. I checked around the perimeter, but there was no sign of anyone, just those tracks, leading toward my cabin and then away again, disappearing into the trees. I locked the door that night. I wasn't scared yet, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I kept my rifle next to me as I lay in bed, listening. Sometime in the early morning hours, I woke up to a sound. A voice. It was distant, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. It sounded like my father. I knew that was impossible. My father had passed away years ago. I told myself I was dreaming, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A low, ragged voice calling my name. I sat up, gripping my rifle, my heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside. I wanted to believe it was an echo, maybe a trick of the wind. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't move. I didn't open the door. I just sat there in the dark, waiting. The voice stopped after a while. The rest of the night passed in silence. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed up my gear, loaded my truck, and took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw it. More tracks in the snow. But this time, they weren't just outside my cabin. They were leading away from it. And they were mine. It was like something had been walking around, mimicking my own steps. I didn't stay to figure it out. I got in my truck and drove, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those tracks, and I wonder if something followed me home. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I need to get it out of my head. Maybe because I know no one would believe me otherwise. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend, a break, a few days away from work, from people, from everything. Just me and the woods, where I didn't have to think about anything except the sound of the wind in the trees and the cold bite of the air. I had found the place online, listed as a secluded hunting cabin near Silver Creek, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The pictures were decent. It looked run down but livable, which was all I needed. Just 4 walls and a roof, enough to keep the weather off me. The owner was some old guy who barely asked any questions, just gave me the key code and told me to leave the cash on the kitchen table when I left. That should have been my first red flag. But I wasn't looking for problems, just peace. The drive up was long and rough. The last few miles were all dirt roads, winding through dense trees that felt like they went on forever. I had to slow to a crawl in some spots to keep my truck from bouncing off the uneven path. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was starting to set, and the woods were already getting dark. The place was even more run down than it had looked in the pictures. The roof sagged in places, and the porch steps were warped from years of rain and neglect. The whole structure looked like it had been swallowed by the forest, barely clinging to the edge of civilization. Inside, it was worse. The furniture was covered in dust, and the air was thick with that smell of damp wood and old fabric. There were no real amenities, just a rusted-out wood stove, a creaky bed frame, and a few shelves with some canned food that looked decades old. The only source of light was a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, which flickered weakly when I switched it on. Still, it didn't matter. I wasn't there for comfort. I just wanted to be alone. The first night was fine, cold but fine. I built a fire in the stove, unrolled my sleeping bag on the bed, and listened to the wind outside. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and there was no cell signal. It was just me and the woods. But something changed the next day. I woke up early, the way I always did when I was out in the wild. The air was freezing, and my breath fogged in front of me as I sat up. The fire had gone out overnight, and the silence was thick and heavy. That was when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, just a single set, leading from the front door down toward the trees. But then I looked closer. They were fresh. I hadn't been outside yet. The prints were deep, the kind that only come from someone moving carefully, deliberately. They led away from the cabin, vanishing into the underbrush at the edge of the woods. I stood there for a long time, just staring. The rational part of my brain told me it had to be a hiker, maybe some hunter passing through. But something about them didn't sit right. They were too close to the door, too precise. I grabbed my rifle. It wasn't loaded, but I held it anyway, stepping carefully down onto the porch. The cold bit at my skin as I followed the tracks. my breath coming out in slow, steady clouds. They led me about 20 yards into the trees before stopping abruptly. Just stopping, like whoever made them had stood there for a long time before turning back. I turned and scanned the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods, stretching in every direction. I told myself it was nothing, just some wanderer passing through, but I still felt it, that tight, crawling sensation in the back of my neck. That night, I locked the door. I barely slept. Every little sound outside had me gripping the rifle tighter, waiting, listening. The wind howled against the windows, and the trees creaked and groaned, but I swore I could hear something else, something moving. When I woke up the next morning, there were more tracks. This time, they weren't leading away. They were leading toward the cabin, right up to the porch, right up to the door. The worst part? There were more than one set this time. 3, maybe 4, coming from different directions, converging. I felt sick. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't care about the money I was supposed to leave. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The truck started fine, but the road was worse than before. It had rained overnight, and the dirt had turned to thick, clinging mud that sucked at my tires. I pushed through it, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they ached. I was maybe a mile from the cabin when I saw it. A shape standing just at the edge of the trees. A man, too still, too rigid, just standing there watching. I pressed the gas harder. The truck fishtailed, tires skidding in the mud, but I didn't let up. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Even then, I drove for miles before pulling over, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I never went back, never told anyone. What could I even say? That I found some footprints in the woods? That I saw someone watching me? They'd think I was imagining things. Maybe I was, but I don't think so, because sometimes, late at night, I dream about that cabin. I dream about the footprints. I dream about the man in the trees. And when I wake up, I swear I can still feel someone watching. The drive out to the woods was long, stretching across miles of empty roads, the trees on either side standing like silent watchers. It was late in the afternoon when I got the call. A missing persons report led to a possible lead, an old hunting cabin on the outskirts of town. I wasn't expecting much. Most of the time, these missing cases turned out to be people who wanted to disappear, runaways, or just someone who lost track of time. I was a cop in a small town, the kind of place where crime wasn't all that common. But when it happened, it felt heavier, like it shook the whole community. People talked, people knew each other, and any time someone went missing, it was personal. The guy in question, Dennis Carter, was a 42-year-old man who worked at a mechanic shop. No criminal record, no enemies, just a regular guy. But he hadn't been seen for over a week, and his wife finally called it in. The cabin was the last place anyone had seen his truck. It was an old hunting cabin, one of those places that had been built decades ago and left to rot. It wasn't owned by anyone anymore, just sitting there in the woods, a place for squatters or hunters to crash in. His wife mentioned that he liked going out there sometimes, but never for this long. I drove my cruiser down the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust as I passed the thick trees. The farther I went, the more isolated it felt. No houses, no signs of people, just the woods stretching out in every direction. The road was rough, barely maintained, just tire tracks in packed dirt. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows. The place looked abandoned. The wood was dark and rotting, the front porch sagging under its own weight. The windows were either boarded up or shattered, and the roof had partially caved in on one side. A rusty old truck sat parked nearby, Carter's truck. That was the first bad sign. If his truck was here, Why hadn't he come home? I stepped out of the car and radioed in, letting dispatch know I was on scene. The air was still, not even a breeze to stir the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. That kind of quiet always put me on edge. I approached the cabin carefully. The front door was slightly open, hanging off its hinges. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it inside. The smell hit me first, that thick, sickly sweet stench that I knew all too well. Death. I stepped inside. The floor creaked under my boots as I moved through the narrow entryway. The place was trashed. Old beer cans, cigarette butts, and a mattress in the corner covered in filth. But none of that mattered because right in the middle of the floor was a body. It was Dennis Carter, or what was left of him. He was sprawled out on his back, his clothes stiff with dried blood. His face was barely recognizable, his eyes hollow and lifeless, his mouth frozen open. His hands were curled up, stiff and claw-like, and his body had started to bloat. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay focused. I'd seen bodies before, but something about this one felt different. His body wasn't just left here, he had been brutalized. His stomach was torn open, his insides exposed like someone had cut him apart. His arms and legs had deep slashes, like he had fought back. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw the marks on the floor. Scratches. Deep, uneven scratches in the wood, leading from the doorway to where he lay. He had been dragged here. I crouched down, examining the wounds. They weren't clean cuts. They were jagged, messy, like something had torn into him, not with a knife, but with something rougher. I'd seen knife wounds before. These weren't that. A cold chill ran down my spine. I stood up and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin had been abandoned for years. No one lived here, no one should have been here. So who? Then I heard it, a rustling sound outside. I turned quickly, my hand instinctively going to my gun. The trees outside stood still, the last bit of daylight slipping away. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the area. Nothing, just trees. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The silence had changed, shifted into something heavier, more oppressive. I called in the body, reporting everything I had seen. They told me backup was on the way, but out here that meant at least 20 minutes. I kept my gun drawn, moving slowly around the cabin, checking the area. I followed the marks on the ground, deeper into the woods. That's when I saw them. More scratches. On the trees. Deep, jagged grooves carved into the bark, as if something with massive claws had raked through them. I kept walking, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then I saw something else. A second body, or at least what was left of it. It was half buried in the leaves, torn apart worse than Carter. The smell was even stronger here. This one wasn't fresh. Whoever or whatever had done this had been here before. I scanned the ground, looking for tracks. There were footprints, but they weren't normal. They were huge, deep imprints in the dirt, and they didn't look like any boot I had ever seen. A sound snapped me out of my thoughts. A twig, snapping, close, too close. I spun around, my gun raised, my flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing. The silence stretched on, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and ran back toward the cabin. The second I reached the porch, I locked myself inside, my back against the door, breathing hard. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching the leaves outside. I gripped my gun tighter. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting, listening. Then I saw the headlights. Backup had finally arrived. By the time the others got there, whatever had been outside was gone. I briefed them on everything, led them to the second body. They searched the area, but they didn't find anything. No tracks, no evidence. Just 2 dead bodies and a lot of questions. The official report ruled it as an animal attack. That was the easiest explanation, but I knew better. That wasn't an animal, and whatever it was still out there. I never went back to that cabin, but sometimes, late at night, I think about those scratches on the trees, and I wonder if it ever left those woods at all. I had taken the job without thinking too much about it. A temporary night shift position at a remote hunting lodge, deep in the woods of Montana. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid decently, and all I had to do was keep an eye on the place while the owner was away for a couple of weeks. I had worked security gigs before, empty buildings, construction sites, overnight parking lots, but nothing as isolated as this. The lodge sat at the edge of a massive private property, miles from the nearest paved road. The owner, a man I had only met once in passing, was some kind of wealthy businessman who used the place a few times a year for hunting trips. He needed someone to stay there overnight, keep the generator running, and make sure no one broke in. Simple enough, or at least that's what I thought. I arrived just before sunset, driving my old truck up the long dirt road leading to the cabin. The property was mostly thick forest, but there were open clearings where hunters had set up blinds and tree stands. The main building itself was a large, 2-story wooden cabin, well-built and sturdy. There was a small shed behind it, along with a massive propane tank and a backup generator. Inside, the place smelled like old wood and damp fabric. A single hallway led from the main entrance to a large living area, furnished with heavy leather chairs, a stone fireplace, and a long wooden dining table. The kitchen was small but well-stocked, and the upstairs had a few bedrooms meant for guests. The owner had left a note on the counter, along with a set of keys. Check the generator once before midnight. Refill if needed. Lock all doors at night. Don't let the fire go out. Asterisk, that last part felt unnecessary. The fall air was cold, but nothing I couldn't handle with a few extra layers. Still, I decided to keep the fire going, mostly for comfort. I wasn't afraid of the dark, but being alone in an unfamiliar place, miles from civilization, put me on edge in a way I didn't expect. I settled into one of the chairs in the main room, letting the fire crackle and warm the space around me. Outside, the sky turned dark quickly. There were no nearby streetlights, no distant headlights from a highway, just pure blackness beyond the windows. It was peaceful for the first few hours. I read a few pages of an old book I found on a shelf, ate a quick meal from the supplies I had brought, and walked around the cabin to check that everything was in order. The only sound was the wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the wood as the cabin settled. Around midnight, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to check the generator. The cold air bit at my face as I walked to the shed. The generator was still running fine, its steady hum the only sound in the otherwise silent night. I checked the fuel levels, saw that they were still good, and decided to head back inside. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A single set of footprints in the dirt, leading from the tree line to the back of the cabin. I stopped in my tracks, my breath visible in the cold air. The prints were fresh, not yet softened by the wind. I hadn't seen them earlier when I first checked the place. I had been alone all evening, at least I thought I had. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but the beam only revealed more trees and undergrowth. No movement, no sound. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was an old set of tracks from earlier in the day, left by some passing hunter. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. Still, I moved quickly back inside, locking the door behind me. I checked the windows, making sure everything was shut tight. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as I stood there, listening. The wind had picked up slightly, making the trees sway outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, but beyond that, the silence felt heavier. I moved to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, keeping it close. For a while, nothing happened. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I sat back down, staring into the fire, waiting for the tension in my chest to ease. Then, just past 2 a.m., I heard something outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the gravel. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was soft, but distinct. Someone was walking just beyond the front door. I reached for my flashlight again, my hand shaking slightly. Taking a deep breath, I moved toward the nearest window, careful not to make a sound. I flicked off the interior lights to keep from being seen and peeked through the glass. The darkness outside was thick, but I could make out the faint shape of something near the trees. A man, standing perfectly still. He wasn't carrying a flashlight, wasn't moving, just standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. My pulse hammered in my ears. I gripped the knife tighter. The seconds dragged on. I couldn't tell if he had seen me, if he knew I was watching. Then, slowly, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I stayed by the window, heart pounding, waiting to see if he would return. The minutes stretched into an hour, then another. No more sounds, no more movement. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the knife within reach, listening for anything unusual. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I stayed near the fire, keeping it alive, my eyes darting toward the windows every few minutes. By the time the sun finally started rising, I was exhausted. I forced myself to step outside, checking the area again. The footprints were still there, leading to the trees, but no sign of the man. I didn't waste any time packing up my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. I locked the cabin, left a message for the owner, and drove back down the dirt road as fast as my truck would allow. I never found out who that man was or why he had been watching the cabin, but I never took another night shift job like that again. Some places, especially the ones deep in the woods, aren't meant to be stayed in alone. It was late September when I took that drive, the kind of evening where the air held on to the last warmth of summer, but the wind carried the first bite of autumn. The sky was a dull gray, threatening rain, the kind of weather that made you think twice about stopping anywhere too long. I hadn't been down that road in years, not since everything ended with Mark. We'd been divorced for nearly a decade, and I had no reason to come this way. But life had a way of circling back to old places, and that evening, I found myself driving past the old cabin he once called home. Mark had bought the place after we split, a little patch of land in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep into the woods off an old state highway. He used to say he wanted to be left alone, away from the world, and I never argued. Suited him. I had my own life in the city, far from the trees and the silence. But now, driving past, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was that the mailbox was gone. It used to be an old metal box, dented from years of abuse, nailed to a wooden post at the start of the dirt road leading up to the cabin. Now, there was nothing, just a splintered stump where the post used to be. The road itself looked bad, worse than I remembered. Deep ruts carved through the dirt, overgrown weeds stretching into the path, like no one had driven up there in a long time. That struck me as strange. Last I heard, Mark still lived out here. A mutual friend mentioned it in passing, something about him keeping to himself more than ever. No visitors, no calls. I figured that was just Mark being Mark. But now, looking at the abandoned road, something gnawed at me. I didn't mean to stop, but I did. I pulled my truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and sat there, staring up the road. The woods were thick on both sides, dense pines swallowing what little light was left in the sky. I told myself I was just curious, that I'd take a quick look and leave. I stepped out, boots pressing into damp earth, the wind picking up through the trees. It was silent out here, too silent. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the wind pushing through the branches, a low and steady sound. I walked up the road, the dirt soft beneath my feet. My footsteps felt too loud. About 50 yards in, I saw the first real sign that something was wrong. Mark's truck was still there, parked off to the side, half buried in dead leaves. The windows were covered in a thick layer of grime, tires sagging into the ground. It looked like it hadn't moved in months, maybe longer. A feeling settled in my gut, heavy and unpleasant. I kept walking. The cabin came into view through the trees, and I stopped dead. The front door was wide open. It wasn't just ajar. It was hanging there, crooked on its hinges, like someone had ripped it open and never bothered to close it. The windows were dark, no sign of light inside. The whole place looked wrong, like it had been left to rot. I stood there, my breath coming slower now, my pulse thick in my ears. I should have left, but I didn't. I stepped forward, feeling that same pull, that same gnawing curiosity that got me out of the truck in the first place. The porch creaked under my weight, old wood groaning like it might give way. I hesitated at the doorway, peering inside. It was a mess. The kitchen table was overturned, chairs scattered. A thick layer of dust coated everything. The air smelled stale, like mold and damp wood. Papers littered the floor, old newspapers curling at the edges. And then I saw the shotgun. It was lying in the middle of the floor, next to a pile of clothes. Something about it made my stomach twist. I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked, every sound magnified in the empty space. I moved through the cabin slowly, taking everything in. The walls were bare, no pictures, no decorations. The couch was covered in dust, a half-empty whiskey bottle sitting on the armrest. And then I saw the bedroom. The door was shut. It was the only door in the house that wasn't open. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the wood. It was ice cold. I pushed. The door swung inward with a long, slow groan. The room was empty. No bed, no furniture. Just bare walls and a single window, its glass cracked down the middle. The floor was covered in dirt, like someone had tracked mud in and never cleaned it. And then I saw the writing. Scrawled across the far wall, in what looked like black paint, were 4 words. "It's still out there." I stared at it, my mind struggling to process. Still out where? The wind picked up outside, rattling the walls. The air in the cabin felt thick, pressing down on me. I turned, ready to leave. I didn't care what happened to Mark anymore. I just wanted to be out of that house. That's when I heard it, a rustling outside. Not the wind, something moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate. I froze. Then, heavy footsteps on the porch. I didn't think. I ran. Straight through the front door, down the steps, my boots slamming into the dirt. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached my truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors. The forest was silent again. I sat there, chest heaving, hands clenched around the steering wheel. I forced myself to look back at the cabin. The door was still open, the windows still dark. Nothing moved, but I knew something was out there. I put the truck in gear and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away, the cabin nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. I never found out what happened to Mark. Some nights I tell myself he just left, abandoned the place and never looked back. But other nights I remember that writing on the wall, it's still out there. And I wonder if, somewhere in those woods, it's waiting. hadn't planned on stopping. The cabin wasn't even supposed to be there. It was one of those things you only find when you're not looking, tucked away in a place no one goes anymore. It was late September, and I was driving through the northern part of Montana, cutting through thick forests and empty highways on my way to a hunting trip. I had been on the road since before sunrise, and the sun had started its slow descent by the time I realized I had miscalculated my gas. There was no cell service, no towns in sight, just miles and miles of pine trees stretching endlessly in every direction. My truck's fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low, and every mile I pushed forward felt like a gamble. I kept thinking I'd see a gas station or a sign pointing me to one, but there was nothing. Just trees, winding roads, and the occasional clearing where the land flattened out. That's when I saw it. A narrow dirt path splitting off from the main road, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. It wasn't marked, no signs, no fencing, just an opening in the trees leading into the woods. I wouldn't have given it a second thought if not for the shape in the distance. A cabin. It sat back in the trees, far enough that I could only make out the dark outline through the branches. The roof was partially caved in on one side, and the front porch sagged as if the ground beneath it had shifted over time. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but something about it gave me pause. I didn't have much of a choice. My truck wouldn't make it much farther. If there was a chance someone had left behind supplies, food, water, maybe even an old fuel canister, it was worth checking. I pulled off onto the dirt path, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The deeper I went, the more overgrown the road became, branches scraping the sides of my truck. It was clear no one had driven this way in a long time. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I had to push through thick underbrush just to open my door. I stepped out, stretching my legs, and took a better look at the place. The wood was darkened from years of exposure, the windows either shattered or covered with grime. The front door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I could see inside through the gap, but only shadows moved in the darkness. I hesitated. There was an uneasiness settling in my gut, a weight pressing down on my chest. I had been around abandoned buildings before, old barns, sheds left to rot. But this was different. This wasn't a place that had simply been forgotten. It was a place that had been left. I pushed forward. The porch groaned beneath my boots as I stepped up, testing each board before putting my full weight down. I reached the door and nudged it open, the wood scraping against the warped floor. Inside, dust hung heavy in the air. It was dim, the last of the evening light filtering through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the room. The cabin wasn't big. One main area with an old iron stove against the far wall, a small table, and a few chairs that looked ready to collapse at the slightest touch. To the left, a narrow hallway led deeper inside. I took a step in. The smell hit me first, stale, musty, mixed with something else, something faint but sharp. It reminded me of copper. I ignored it and kept moving. Most of the furniture was covered in dust, untouched. The shelves above the stove held a few rusted cans, labels peeled away. I checked the drawers, finding only old utensils and a broken pocket knife. No fuel, no food. Then I saw them. Boot prints. They trailed across the dust-covered floor, leading from the doorway I had just entered through to the hallway at the back. Someone had been here, recently. I felt a cold prickle crawl up my spine. The prints were deep, not the kind left behind by years of settled dust. They were fresh, and they didn't belong to me. I turned toward the hallway, following the tracks with my eyes. The corridor was narrow, the walls lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. There were two doors, one slightly open, the other shut tight. I listened. Silence. I moved forward, careful, keeping my steps light. I pushed the first door open. A bedroom. Small, barely enough space for the old mattress pushed against the wall. The blankets were still in place, stiff with dust. No signs of recent use. I stepped back into the hall and reached for the second door. It was locked. I tried again, jiggling the handle. Nothing. That's when I heard it. A creak. Not from behind the door. From the main room. From where I had just been. I turned slowly. My breath caught in my throat. Something was different. Then I saw it. The front door. It was closed. I hadn't closed it. I stood frozen, heart pounding against my ribs. I was no longer alone. I moved back, slow and careful, reaching for the hunting knife on my belt. My fingers wrapped around the handle, knuckles white. Then, a shadow passed in front of the window. I barely had time to react before something slammed into the cabin wall outside. Hard. The whole structure shook. I bolted. I didn't think. I ran straight for the front door, yanking it open. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt different, thicker, colder. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still, watching. Then, from the side of the cabin, footsteps. Fast. Running. Coming straight for me. I didn't wait. I sprinted for my truck, tearing through the underbrush. My boots slipped on the damp ground, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind me, the heavy crunch of footsteps keeping pace. I reached my truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered once, twice before roaring to life. Headlights flooded the clearing, and for a split second I saw him, standing at the edge of the trees. A man, tall, gaunt, clothes hanging off his frame in tatters. His face was pale, hollowed, sunken eyes locked onto mine, and in his hand a knife, the same kind I carried. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires kicking up dirt, and tore out of there, the branches snapping against the sides as I hit the road. I didn't stop driving, not until I reached a town nearly 50 miles away. I never went back, never reported it. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some cabins aren't abandoned. They're waiting. I never planned on staying at the cabin for long. It was just supposed to be a short break, 1 week, maybe 2 at most. After years of working long hours in construction, I wanted some time alone in a quiet place, away from the noise of the city, the constant hum of machines, and the weight of other people's voices filling up my days. I figured a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, not far from the river, would be the perfect escape. I found it through a guy I knew, an old coworker from a roofing job in Missoula. He told me about a place his uncle had left behind, a small, solid cabin nobody was using anymore. It wasn't listed anywhere. No paperwork, no leases, just a key and a warning. Make sure you're okay with being alone out there. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed up supplies, canned food, a rifle, some clothes, and enough gas to run the generator for a while, and made the drive up from Billings. The road twisted through thick forest, getting narrower and rougher the deeper I went. I lost cell service before I even reached the last turnoff. That was fine. I didn't need my phone. The cabin sat on a stretch of land about 100 yards from the river. It was smaller than I expected but built sturdy. A single-room structure with thick walls and a metal roof. No running water, no electricity unless I used the generator, and a wood-burning stove in the corner for heat. The inside smelled like dust and old wood. A few pieces of furniture were still there. A table, a couple of chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress. A single window faced the river. The rest of the place felt closed in, the thick logs making it dark even during the day. That first night, everything felt normal. I got the generator running long enough to heat up some food, read by lantern light, and fell asleep listening to the wind in the trees. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. It started with little things. The first was the footprints. The ground around the cabin was mostly packed dirt and pine needles, but in the mornings, there was always some moisture from the river. On the second day, as I stepped outside with my coffee, I noticed tracks near the porch. At first, I figured they were mine, but when I looked closer, I saw they were different, longer, narrower. Someone had been walking around outside during the night. I checked around the cabin, expecting to find more, but they stopped near the back, right where the tree line started. No signs of anyone coming or going. That night, I locked the door. The second thing was the smell. Came in waves, heavy and sour, like rotting meat. The first time I noticed it, I figured an animal had died somewhere nearby, but I couldn't find anything. No carcass, no bones, nothing. The smell would come and go, sometimes strong enough to make me gag, then fading as if it had never been there at all. The third thing was the noise. It started just after sunset. A steady, rhythmic tapping. Not loud, just slow and deliberate, like someone knocking against wood. At first, I thought it was a branch against the cabin, but when I went outside with my flashlight, there was nothing. Just the trees, the river moving in the dark, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep much that night. By the fourth day, the sense of unease had settled into my bones. I tried to go about my days as normal, splitting wood, fishing by the river, keeping the stove going. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I've spent plenty of time alone before, working on jobs in the middle of nowhere, and I know the difference between my mind playing tricks on me and something being wrong. Every time I looked at the tree line, I half expected to see someone standing there. I never did, but I could feel them. The smell got worse. I kept checking around, looking for whatever was rotting, but still found nothing. That night, I set up a tripwire with empty cans around the perimeter, just in case. The next morning, I found the cans scattered. The wire hadn't been broken. Something had stepped over it, careful enough to avoid making noise. I walked the area again, checking for tracks, and found them about 10 yards from the cabin. The same narrow footprints, leading from the trees, stopping near the edge of the clearing, then disappearing. No return trail, no signs of anyone running or walking away. By then, I knew someone was out there. I spent most of that day inside, rifle close at hand. The air felt heavier than before, pressing in around the cabin like a weight. That night, the knocking came back. This time, it wasn't just tapping. It was louder, closer, moving around the cabin in slow, deliberate steps. I killed the lantern and sat in the dark, rifle aimed at the door. I thought about turning on the generator, flooding the clearing with light, but I didn't want whoever was out there to know exactly where I was. The knocking stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up my gear, threw everything into the truck, and tried to start the engine. Nothing. I checked under the hood. Nothing was cut, no signs of damage. The truck just wouldn't start. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the tree line, knowing I had no way out. I spent that day trying to fix the truck, but nothing worked. The battery was fine. The fuel was fine. It just wouldn't turn over. That night, the noises came back. Not just knocking this time. Footsteps. I sat in the dark, gripping my rifle, listening as someone, or something, moved just outside the cabin walls. The smell was overwhelming, thick and rancid, seeping in through the cracks in the logs. Then, the sound of something dragging across the door. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, waiting. The dragging stopped. Then silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. When I woke, it was morning, and the smell was gone. I didn't waste time. I took my rifle, my gear, and set out on foot. If I could follow the river south, I knew I'd eventually hit a road. The forest felt wrong as I walked, the trees too still, the air too quiet. After about an hour, I heard movement behind me, slow footsteps matching my own pace. I didn't look back. I walked faster. The footsteps followed. Then, up ahead, I saw something on the ground. Carcass. A deer. Its body torn open. Its insides missing. But it wasn't fresh. It had been there for days, bloated, covered in flies. And there, next to it, were my footprints from the day before. I had been walking in circles. I don't remember much after that. I ran. I don't know how far or how long, but eventually, I reached a dirt road. A truck passed by hours later. A local guy who stopped when he saw me standing there, covered in sweat and dirt, gripping my rifle like my life depended on it. I didn't tell him what happened. I just told him my truck broke down and I needed a ride. I never went back to the cabin. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I was never supposed to leave that place, and I almost didn't. It was late October when I agreed to help my uncle with his cabin. He had bought the place a few years back, intending to fix it up and turn it into a hunting lodge. The cabin sat deep in the forests of northern Montana, miles from the nearest town. I had never been there before, but he told me it was in decent shape, just needed some maintenance. The problem was he had injured his leg a few weeks back, so he asked me if I could spend a couple of weeks up there, fixing things and making sure everything was in order before the winter storms rolled in. I had time off work, so I figured, why not? A couple of weeks away from the city sounded good. No traffic, no noise, just peace and quiet. I loaded up my truck with supplies, food, tools, extra gas for the generator, and set off early in the morning. The drive took nearly 6 hours, most of it on long, empty roads cutting through endless forests. The last stretch was a dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck, winding through thick trees and up into the hills. I didn't see a single house for miles. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. The place was just how I imagined it. Old but solid, built from thick logs, with a sloped metal roof to keep the snow off. There was a small shed out back for firewood, a rusted water pump near the porch, and a narrow clearing surrounding the cabin before the trees swallowed everything up. I parked my truck beside the cabin, stepped out, and took in the quiet. No sounds of cars, no hum of city life, just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of branches. Felt different, not exactly eerie, just isolated. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The cabin smelled like wood and dust, but it was warm enough. My uncle had left plenty of firewood stacked beside the stove, and the generator still had fuel. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was intact. The place was safe. That first night, I sat by the fire with a book, listening to the wind outside. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving in the woods, but it was probably just animals. Deer, maybe, coyotes, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I got to work. I checked the roof, reinforced some of the weaker beams, and made sure the water pump was working. Everything seemed fine, but around midday, I found something strange. There were footprints in the dirt behind the cabin. Not mine, not my uncle's. These tracks were fresh, leading from the tree line to the back of the cabin and stopping right at the wall. No return tracks, no sign of someone walking away. I frowned, scanning the woods. No one there, just the wind moving through the trees. It bothered me, but I told myself it was probably an old hunter passing through. Maybe he stopped to check out the cabin and then left another way. Still, I kept my rifle close that night just in case. By the third day, more things started feeling off. I would leave my tools in one place and find them somewhere else later. I heard rustling outside at night, closer than before. Once, I swore I saw movement between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. but every time I looked, there was nothing there. On the fourth day, I woke up to find the back door unlocked. I knew for a fact I had locked it before bed. I checked the whole cabin, rifle in hand. Nothing was missing, no signs of forced entry. It didn't make sense. I started feeling on edge, like I wasn't alone out there. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I decided to set up a tripwire. Nothing fancy, just some fishing line and bells strung across the back door. If anything came through, I'd hear it. I barely slept that night. Sometime past midnight, I heard the bells jingle. My eyes snapped open. The fire had died down, leaving only the dim glow of embers. I reached for my rifle, heart hammering. Silence. I stayed still, listening. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan. But underneath that, I thought I heard something else. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something being dragged across the wooden porch. I held my breath, gripping the rifle tight. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I sat there in the dark, waiting. 5 minutes, 10, nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted off. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were deep scratch marks in the wood, right outside the door. Not from an animal. Something, someone had been out there. I didn't bother with repairs that day. I kept my rifle loaded and stayed alert. As night fell, the tension in my chest grew worse. I kept every light on, every door locked. The tripwire was set. And then, right around midnight, I heard the bells again. I grabbed my rifle and stepped toward the door. My hands were shaking. Then 3 slow knocks. Knock. 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 I froze. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night? I didn't move, didn't answer. More knocking, then silence. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, but eventually the sounds stopped. I barely slept. When morning came, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear, loaded my truck, and locked up the cabin. I didn't care if my uncle needed more work done. Something wasn't right out there. I drove out fast, barely looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't see anything. No movement. No figures between the trees. But when I finally reached the main road, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The passenger side door of my truck. It was unlocked star. I hadn't opened it. I drove straight back to town, not stopping once. I never went back to the cabin. My uncle didn't believe me when I told him what happened. He laughed it off, said I was imagining things. A few months later, he called me. Someone had broken into the cabin. The place was ransacked, furniture overturned, food supplies gone. But the worst part, whoever had been there left something behind. A knife, stabbed into the wood of the back door. Right below it, carved into the wood, "See you soon." I never went back.